Hello, everybody. This is Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by filmmaker and journalist Paul J. On today's episode, we will focus on the 25th anniversary of his documentary Hitman Hart, Wrestling with Shadows. It is my great pleasure to welcome Paul J.
Hi, thanks very much.
As I understand, Paul, you are a self-taught filmmaker, and if I'm not mistaken, Wrestling with Shadows was your second film after The Birth of Language. What was your takeaway from Wrestling with Shadows in terms of filmmaking and in terms of a moral concept?
I don't think it was my second film, maybe fourth or fifth or something, but it was in terms of important feature-length film. Yeah, I guess it was. Well, the film was about values. It was about, in some ways, it wasn't really about wrestling in the sense that I wasn't all that interested in wrestling when I did the film. I did it because wrestling is such a great metaphor for what's going on in society. And it was a great story. The Bret Hart story, Bret had been the son of a family that was a wrestling family with 12 kids, and 6 of the daughters married wrestlers. 6 boys went into wrestling. And the mother says in the film, the one thing I never wanted was any of my kids to be in wrestling. But the story is basically about Bret Hart versus Vince McMahon, who was the head of the World Wrestling Federation, as it was called at the time. And McMahon is sort of like his father figure, who sort of betrays him, and they have this great battle. But the film becomes about, are there values? Is there a morality that matters, that's more than just about making money? And so that was the theme I was particularly interested in. And then the whole backstory of Bret, whose father was also a wrestler and taught wrestling, and kind of tortured other wrestlers in the basement of their house, because wrestling is really theater, but he would do something called shoot wrestling, the father, where he would really painfully put these guys into submission holds until they screamed for their lives. And that's in the film, and it also haunted Bret as he grew up. So it's about Bret's backstory, and it leads to this big confrontation with Vince McMahon, where Ted Turner's wrestling federation competes with Bret and offers him a big contract. And Bret decides he isn't going to take it, stays with Vince McMahon out of loyalty, mostly. And also his belief that his character, Hitman Hart, actually stands for something important to him, and he thinks important to the fans. And then there's the big showdown in Montreal where Vince wants him to lose the belt because he's going to move to the Turner operation. And Vince betrays him. And you got to watch the film, but it's called the Montreal Screwjob. And we just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But it's really, in terms of the broader meaning message of the film, it's about Bret having some sense of loyalty, have some sense that character he played, Hitman Hart, as he says, stood for good values and meant something. And even though he knew it was a character, although sometimes I think that got a little blurred for Bret, where Bret, the real person, ended and where the character began, he took it quite seriously. And so this ending became a massive story in the wrestling world and outside it. But the film wasn't meant for wrestling fans by any means. It's been called one of the best docs ever made and whatever. And there's another side of what the importance of the documentary for me is that how do people believe either that this is real, which is up until our film, a lot of people believe wrestling was real. And we were, because Bret got so screwed by Vince, he eventually said okay to us showing how wrestling was theater, and we actually showed the preparation and how for the matches, how they were scripted. But once people do know it's theater, why do they still get so emotionally involved? And I guess you can ask the same question of why do people get so emotionally involved when they go to any movie, to a movie or to a piece of theater, stage theater. And, because people suspend their disbelief. They know it's not real. You can't believe that it's real, but you suspend that disbelief. Well, the thing that hit me as I made the film and since is that our whole culture is based on suspending disbelief. And that's okay at a wrestling show or a movie. It's not okay about the real world. And most of us are suspending our disbelief. We know climate change is an existential crisis. We know the risk of nuclear war is real and an existential crisis. And we don't believe. Well, let me tell you, at the 25th anniversary screening of the wrestling film, the Toronto Film Festival did a special honorary screening. And at the end of it, in the Q&A, I asked the audience, how many people believe that the elites and our governments are going to effectively deal with the climate crisis? Not a single hand went up. I said, how many people believe our elites and our governments are going to deal with the risk of nuclear war? Not a single hand went up. So I said, well, we're facing such threats. You do not believe the people that are really in control of society are going to do anything about it. But you carry on and act normally. In other words, you suspend that disbelief and just carry on. And so I think this issue of wrestling is an important metaphor. One, for this suspended disbelief about such a critical time we live in, and also for the whole state of American politics. The way mass media reports, mainstream media, reports on what goes on in Congress, and even this theater now that's going on about the debt ceiling. And, when do you hear the major media news talk about the role the billionaires play in how these decisions get made? They treat the political theater that goes on in Congress as if that's all there is. And it's like wrestling. It's like taking wrestling, what goes on in the ring, and reporting on it as if it's real. Hulk Hogan did this and Bret Hart did that, and report on it like these are actual events. Well, to a large extent, that's what's going on in the way they cover politics, because it's not that the politicians don't have some real power and there isn't a real fight going on, but the real story is what goes on behind the scenes. The relationship of the lobbyist to the politician, and the lobbyists who represent corporations and billionaires. And that's the real locus of power. And the theater that goes on for us is, to a large extent, the role of this political stratum. It's not quite as artificial as wrestling, but close to it.
I also happen to believe that Wrestling with Shadows is one of the great documentaries. I think I was 13 years old when I watched it for the first time, and I was already a wrestling fan, but I hadn't been privy to the information as to how wrestling was staged and choreographed, and what went on behind the scenes and so on. When was Bret and his legacy brought to your attention? When you started making the film, you couldn't possibly have known how things would unfold. And then the Montreal Screwjob happened and so on. How did you meet Bret Hart, and what was your first intention with the documentary?
Well, I saw him on television, as part of the wrestling show, but it was an interesting moment. He was in Germany. They were doing a show in Germany, and he was sort of on a bench next to the Rhine, the river. and it was dark and it was moody. There were clouds and wind in his hair and all this. You know, it looked like a scene out of a movie already. And he was talking about whether he should keep wrestling or not. Maybe it was the time to retire. And like a lot of the best wrestling scripts, they're usually based on some element of truth. And there was element of truth there. His contract with the WWF was coming to an end. And he'd already gotten some feelers from Turner. And he didn't know what he wanted to do, whether he even wanted to keep wrestling or not. So it was partly, well, in wrestling, there's a thing called kayfabe, and then there's a thing called shoot. So kayfabe is when wrestlers are in character. Shoot is when they're not in character. Like if two wrestlers go to a restaurant, they're talking to each other. If it's just the two of them, they're having a shoot conversation where they talk about the business and Vince and how to get better positioning in the storylines and so on. If someone sits down next to them who doesn't know, then they go kayfabe, which means they start talking in character as if wrestling is real. Well, that interview with him on the bench was close to a shoot interview, close to how he was really feeling. So I'm a dual citizen, but I'm kind of more Canadian. I grew up in Canada. And as a filmmaker, you're always looking for a good story that is Canadian, that also transcends Canada, would play in the world. And at the time, Bret was maybe the most famous Canadian in the world because, WWF was saying 1 billion people a week were watching wrestling then. And I don't know what their numbers are now, but they're still pretty big. So I happened to be at the Banff TV Festival because another one of my films had won an award there. And so I went I just knocked on Bret's door, actually. I don't know, I can't even remember how I found his house because he lives in Calgary near Banff. And I told him I want to make a film about you and so on. And so the original film was just about this behind the scenes of wrestling, very much about the family, this strange wrestling family in Calgary. And one of the things that inspired me to do the film was an article, an essay written by Roland Barthes, who's a very famous French philosopher. And he writes about wrestling in Paris in 1958. Which is, not that different, pro wrestling, at a time when more people thought it was real than theater, but it was theater. And Barthes wrote about how much this was like Greek tragedies and Greek theater, how, a wrestler would play the hero and another one plays the villain and one plays loyalty, another one plays, betrayal, and they played basic primal emotions. And that allows the crowd to kind of step out of their normal, in many cases, humdrum identity and get to participate in that morality play, this primal emotions that most people don't get to express very often in our culture. And he had this wonderful line in the essay called wrestling is light without shadows and emotion without reserve. And people get a chance to do that, to be angry, to scream, to boo, to cheer without any consequences. There's a guy in the film says that almost word for word. He says, we get to scream and boo at these guys. And they can't come up and hit us, we're part of the show. And in that way, wrestling is very Brechtian, where this idea of the fourth wall doesn't exist because the audience becomes part of the show. And the wrestlers play to the audience, talk to the audience, and they scream at each other. So whether it's suspended disbelief because people know it isn't real, although I would say a majority of the audience wasn't sure whether it was real or not, because as Bret says in the film, looking like you're really smashing somebody in the face with your foot and not hurting them, that's an art. And the ones that are good at it, you don't know whether it's real or not. You know, in this final match in Montreal, Bret and Shawn Michaels go at it and they throw each other out of the ring. They're wrestling on a cement floor in the arena in Montreal. And we were filming, God, we couldn't have been more than 10 feet away. And they were, you know, hitting, throwing each other on the ground. And I turned to my camera woman and Joan Hutton, who did a great job. And I said, holy shit. Because we knew they actually did hit each other. I mean, in real terms, they did. And I said, geez, are they actually fighting? That's how good they were, because they certainly weren't actually fighting. So wrestling intrigued me, you know, because of that Roland Barthes article, how much emotion and how much it allowed people to have feelings that, other than kind of once in a while expressing like road rage, or if there's domestic violence going on. But how many people put up with humiliation and indignities at work every day and can never really express what they feel about it? You know, most people, you know, put up with economic hardship. They put up with government and other things that, you know, people who rule their lives and really feel like they have so little to say about it. In spite of all this talk about democracy and all that, people have very little to say about what really matters in their lives. And they see their kids, many people, you know, they see their kids on drugs or committing suicide, and, you know, a privileged elite, you know, can kind of cope with it in many ways, but a lot of people don't have the means to cope with it. But they don't get a way to express it, except, you know, sometimes, you know, you go to some of the poorest areas of some of the bigger American cities. I lived in Baltimore for almost a decade. And there it starts getting expressed with guns by some people, because the situation just becomes so unbearable. So wrestling, that whole film for me was a way to explore this. And then as we got into the film, the storyline kind of just unfolded on its own, because Vince, you know, Bret signs a new contract with Vince, but Vince doesn't like the contract because Bret's able to leverage the offer from the Turner operation and get probably the best contract in the history of the WWF, 20 years, millions of dollars. And from the day I think Vince signed it, he knew he was going to look for a way to get out of it. And so he's, you know, Bret being Canadian, he talks Bret into doing a storyline where Bret's a hero in Canada, but he becomes anti-American in his rhetoric. And he goes to Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, I think it is. He says, you know, if I had to stick an enema up the rear of an American city, I would stick it in Pittsburgh, something like that. A lot of these lines were written for him. But then he goes to Calgary, and in a show there, he starts, and it's kind of hilarious because Alberta, to a large extent, is like your American Texas politically. And he starts talking about, we have health care, we care about each other, we have a health care plan, you don't, and we don't beat each other up on the street corners, and we don't persecute people based on their color. I mean, that's not all quite so true as he was saying, but the crowd is cheering, the Canadian crowd cheers, and then he goes to the US and the American. So this storyline just started happening because that's how Vince and his writers were unfolding it, which gave us a whole leg for the film. We didn't quite understand at the time that this was a setup. He wanted to kind of ruin Bret's character in the US to lower his value if he wound up eventually going to Turner. But even that said, as we start, we essentially finished shooting. And the best storyline we had, if all we cared about was a good film, we would have ended, was the dysfunctionality of the Hart family. And I don't want to go into it too much because this is kind of where I'm headed, but quite a few of the, we interviewed pretty well everybody, all the kids, and they were telling us heart-wrenching stories, and stories they shouldn't have told me. Honestly, if I'd been their media advisor, I would say, don't you tell this guy this stuff on camera. And I don't know, I'm a pretty good interviewer. And the truth is, a lot of times people open up in a way I say to myself, you shouldn't be telling me all this. But as we got near the end of the film and essentially had finished shooting, the best story I had wasn't the wrestling story, even though I had great elements to it. It was the family. And I didn't want to do it. So I was figuring out ways to do it with the wrestling. And then I find out, or I guess I'm talking to Bret, and he says he's going to do this match in Montreal. And so I went out to Calgary and we filmed more. And, I said, we were actually finished the budget for filming. I said, the hell with it. We'll find the money. And we followed the storyline and we went to Montreal and we filmed this, what turned out to be, a gift from the documentary film gods, because it gave us this incredible ending of the betrayal. And we secretly mic'd Bret in his conversation with Vince. And anyway, you couldn't have scripted it. In fact, a lot of people don't believe it was real. They think somehow we were in on a scripted job, which we certainly were not. But you couldn't have written an ending any better than we got.
Thank you very much, Paul, for elaborating on that. Many people to this day actually still believe that the whole thing was a work. And it's such a heart-wrenching story. And you just told me that you did extensive interviews also with the Hart family and also the brothers and sisters, but there isn't that much left in the final version of the film. How much influence did Bret and the WWE have in terms of the final version of the film and the final cut of the film?
Well, I found out later why the contract didn't have any editorial control on their side at all. And it's because they'd gotten so many pitches for films that never happened. And they just never took it very seriously. People were coming at them with, can we do this doc and that doc and whatever? And they said, sure, okay. And they never, just most of the films, I think maybe almost all of the films, just went away. So they didn't pay a hell of a lot of attention to it. So I had one agreement with them, and it was a verbal agreement. It wasn't even written. Was Bret could have a say on whether we were exposing the theater of wrestling. And I agreed to that because I figured if we were doing a film about a magician, I would have agreed not to show how the magic tricks are done. Otherwise, what magician's going to agree to have a film done about them? And I figured this is pretty much the same thing. The art of the theater of wrestling is like a magic trick. It's, distraction, illusion. I didn't need to show how that was done. I also felt, frankly, if you don't know this is theater already, you need more help than I can provide. So I didn't feel this isn't a piece of investigative journalism to expose that wrestling is theater. I mean, you should know this is theater. If you don't, okay, whatever. But as we started filming, now I just should add, Bret contractually or verbally or in any other way, Bret had zero editorial control on any content. I showed him some cuts, but he had no right to tell me what to do. And in fact, he didn't make a comment a single time in the whole process. And then when it came to exposing wrestling, early on, like there was a meeting going on. He was going to go into a meeting to work out the script for such and such match. And he had a mic on, a wireless mic. And I could see them where they were meeting, that we could shoot it from where they were standing. And I said to him, is it okay? What do you want us to do about this? Is it all right to shoot? And he said, you know what? Shoot anything you want. No restrictions. And later we'll look at it. And if I think you're kind of going too far in exposing the theater, then I'll ask you if you'll, cut something out. But for now, just shoot whatever you want, which is, music to my ear. It's exactly what I wanted. And that's what we did. We shot everything. And we have, several times in the film. There's a whole sequence in the film where we film the script, and then we have the voiceover of how they're planning it over the match as it takes place. So the answer to your question is, other than that, which he never exercised, because he never said, don't use this because you're exposing too much. And on the issue of the family or any of the other content, he actually never said anything. I mean, I wouldn't have cut anything otherwise, unless for some reason he thought it was like libelous or, something was really being misrepresented. But that it never happened.
How the story unfolded is so interesting and fascinating. There also probably was a lot of miscommunication. Bret was offered a lot of money back then by WCW. Bret actually didn't want to leave. You can see that very clearly when he said he talked to Vince McMahon and asked him, what would you do? Talk me into staying. And later on, it was kind of depicted as if Bret simply wanted to leverage himself into getting as much money as he wanted. But I don't think that was his primary concern.
Well, no, he did. I mean, he wound up getting a better contract with Vince than Vince ever wanted to give.
Correct. Yeah.
If it hadn't been for the Turner offer, Bret never would have gotten 20 years. And I don't know how many, I can't remember how many millions of dollars over 20 years. It wasn't nearly as good a contract as Turner, but it was a way better contract than Vince wanted to give anybody. And he didn't like the precedent set. And that's the whole point of what happened here. I mean, it's because Vince so hated being forced into that contract that he wanted to find a way to get rid of Bret, but he needed to do it on his terms, not Bret just walking and going to the WCW. He wanted time. And he says in the film, and I think it's true, he says, I was talked into keeping Bret by all the people around me. They said, you can't let Bret go. He's too big a star. And he says, he didn't, this wasn't, he was supposed to do an interview with us, but once this happened, he refused. So we used some clips he said on the WCW, the WWF broadcast, now WWE, where he said, people around me talked me into keeping Bret. I wish I hadn't. And I think that hit him, that he wish he hadn't. And then he devised a plan to get rid of Bret. And then after trying to destroy the character of the Hitman, he goes to Bret and he says, I can't pay you this anymore. We're in too much financial trouble. And, which I think was a lie or not, I don't know, but whatever. He essentially told Bret, go to the WCW now because I'm not going to pay this. Well, when the film was done, I guess Bret by then had gone to the WCW and he told them how good the film was. And so I got approached by WCW if they could have a look at a cut. We were almost done. And I said, yeah, but you can't show it to anybody. They said they wanted to see it for a possible pay-per-view. So they did. They offered us a pay-per-view. I don't think there's ever been a documentary before or since that had a pay-per-view. And they said they would guarantee us $500,000 And in all likelihood, we would make more than $1 million because it was a 500,000 guarantee and a percentage of the sales. And, imagine $1 million in, I don't know, what the hell year was that, 1998 or 1999, I can't remember. It would have been a few $1 million now. And so we said, sure, let's do it. And so, but we had a problem. There's a thing called errors and omissions insurance. And what that means is you have an insurance company that vets your film essentially on behalf of the broadcasters. In our case, the main American broadcaster was A&E. And then BBC was in for England, and there was CTV and TVO in Canada and Arte in Europe. Anyway, all of them depended that, and this is not just for this film, it's for virtually everything that goes to a main broadcaster. You have to have an insurance company that vets your copyright and your privacy waivers, and that everything that, the broadcaster won't get sued for airing the film. And so the insurance companies hold a lot of power over these issues. Well, we had, in our contract with WWF, as it was called, they had agreed to give us unlimited access to their stock footage library, to, wrestling matches, and privacy releases for all the wrestlers who were in the film. And we couldn't fulfill our insurance obligations without cleared footage and the privacy releases. So we kept writing WWF lawyers and McMahon, and they wouldn't even answer us. And the contract was absolutely clear. They owed it to us. It was not ambiguous. And we were getting closer and closer to having to deliver the film. And you can't deliver without the insurance company, and thus we needed WWF to fulfill. And they probably knew that, which is why they weren't responding. Because by that point, they didn't want the film. They didn't need a film all about Bret Hart when now Bret Hart works for the competing wrestling operation. So I'm on the phone with Turner's lawyers, and they say, and we talk about the pay-per-view and this and that. And I said, well, what are we going to do about the insurance and E&O? And they said, well, you'll have to sue them. And I said, oh, really? I said, how am I going to afford to sue them? And they said, oh, we'll pay for it. I said, you'll pay for us to sue McMahon so you can run the pay-per-view. Well, sort of, they said, but they said, we'll pay for the lawsuit up to a cap of $750,000 in legal fees. That's like as much as we might have made from the pay-per-view. And they said, yeah, we'll pay $750,000 for you to sue McMahon. I said, okay, great. I said, so that means we're going to sue and get an injunction and force them to give us the privacy releases and the footage. And there's a long silence in the phone call. And then they said, well, we could try that, but it's very difficult to get an injunction to make someone do something. So it's unlikely we can make them give you the releases and the footage. What we'll do is we'll help you sue them for damages. And the lawyer says, I never say any client has a slam dunk case, but you've got a slam dunk case. They owe you this stuff. Because they won't give it to you and you can't get your insurance, you can't deliver. And because you deliver, you're going to default on all your broadcast contracts, never mind the pay-per-view. You can sue to recover your losses. And I said, hold on here. So I can sue them about my losses, but there won't be a film. That's right. There won't be a film. So I fax McMahon and his lawyer. That conversation was like on a Wednesday. And I said, if you don't make it clear that you're going to give me the privacy releases and the footage by Friday at noon, we're going ahead with a lawsuit against you. So an hour later, not an hour later, that was on the Thursday. So on Friday at 11:45, like 15 minutes before the noon, I get a fax. We're in the days of fax back then. I get a fax back from WWF, which says, you can have everything you want on one condition. You cannot do any business with this film with Ted Turner or any company he's involved with. So obviously they knew about the pay-per-view, which was supposed to be a big secret. But they must have had a spy in Turner's camp, in WCW's camp. And I never found out how they knew, but obviously they knew. And not only would that have killed the pay-per-view, it also killed a deal we had for VHS distribution with Warner's, because Turner was involved in Warner's. And so it meant we had to choose the film or a lawsuit where we might have made several $1 million, all paid for by the WCW. It may have gone on for 2-3 years, but we had every likelihood of winning the lawsuit or make the film. Well, obviously, we chose make the film. I said, okay, great, but I'm here to make the film. I knew by then how good the film was. I don't know, if I thought the film was shitty, I may have chosen the lawsuit, but we knew we had, a great film. And so we wrote back and said, okay. And in fact, within days, we started getting privacy releases. They invited us down to Connecticut to go through the archives, and we got everything we wanted, except all the money. Wow. The problem is not only did we lose the money from the pay-per-view and the VHS release, when we went to go and find another VHS distributor, McMahon started to screw with us. So what would happen is we'd go to such and such distributors, and they, because they knew, they watched the film, they got in hold of the WWF and said, we're thinking of taking this VHS on. What do you think? And they started getting, well, you better be careful because we might sue you. They wouldn't have had any real grounds for doing it. But McMahon had such a reputation for using litigation as a form of warfare, regardless of whether he had a case or not. He would just try to outspend people and use the threat of being able to outspend people to push people around. So all of a sudden, a film that everybody wanted to distribute, we couldn't get anybody. And finally, we got Trimark to came in, small at the time, a mid to small size, and they came in. But we never made the same kind of money out of it. And then the film was invited to the Sundance Film Festival. And then after the screening, I got approached by 4 or 5 producers who represented big name production companies with output deals at Hollywood studios. Danny DeVito's company, Scott Rudin's company. It went on and on. Like everybody, these were all production companies that had offices on the lots of the different major production companies. And I went to LA because they wanted to turn it into a scripted film. And they wanted the rights to my doc to turn it into a scripted film. And so I went on this crazy tour of meeting the vice president of Paramount and Warner Brothers and you name it. And everybody taken to them by these different production companies. And all the meetings were like, couldn't be more enthusiastic. And then later they all passed. And I talked to our lawyer about it. The only thing that made sense is they did the same thing. They got hold of McMahon or WWF. We're thinking of making a feature based on the doc, and the same thing. They were told, well, we'll sue you. And nobody wanted to get into a litigation war. So that all went away. So from a financial point of view, Bret got screwed in Montreal. Well, we got screwed after Montreal. Even though the film aired practically in every TV market in the world and won almost every festival in the world.
There is a Blu-ray edition available, which also features new interviews with you and Bret, and it also features the life and death of Owen Hart, a documentary which you co-directed with Sally Blake. There is an interesting scene towards the end of Wrestling with Shadows. Bret had spoken to his then wife Julie, and he said, "I just talked to Vince, and it's gonna be a disqualification." And she says, "I don't believe it." When did you suspect that something was wrong and that this could turn into a potential double cross?
Never. I didn't. When Julie said it, I turned and said, "I don't think she knows about the conversation Bret just had with Vince." And oh, you're right. He kind of suggested that to her. Anyway, I thought she was wrong. I never suspected it. I thought she turned out to be right, but I heard, because we secretly recorded that conversation where Bret and Vince plan out what's supposed to end in a shemazel or shemaz or whatever.
Yeah.
I took that at face value, that is what it was. So the answer is never. Even when it happened, I wasn't sure what had happened.
Nice. Yeah. Thank you, Paul.
I mean, I knew how it was supposed to end. So I guess when it happened, I said to myself, wait a second, this wasn't supposed to happen. Did they, I wasn't even sure if they hadn't had another conversation I wasn't aware of.
Okay. Well, I figured that the atmosphere in the Molson Center, or today I think it's called the Bell Center, was really explosive. It must have been a really explosive atmosphere back then, especially when Bret lost. Fans were starting to get angry. Earl Hebner fled the scene all of a sudden.
He's the guy who was the referee, for people who don't know. Yeah.
Right, he was the referee, and
he ran to his car and got the hell out of there.
Yeah,
because he thought Bret would come after him, because he had promised Bret he wouldn't allow this to happen.
Correct. And Paul, you did continue on with your documentary, and you kept shooting some footage. And you were in the locker room, and then Bret asked you to leave, basically. Did you ever have a certain amount of concern as to what might happen if they spotted you with a camera, especially when the shit was hitting the fan? Pardon my French.
Well, when we went in, when you watch the film, you hear other wrestlers' voices, but you never see them. So we followed Bret into the locker room. And I knew how sensitive this would be, because it wasn't just about what happened, but this was now going to be a shoot. They're not in character. And while Bret might have thought it was okay to film out of character, the others did not. Nobody else was in on the idea that we were shooting people, shoot, not kayfabe. So I said, as we started to shoot, I looked around to all the other guys. I said, okay, we're only going to focus on Bret here. Camera's only on Bret. And so nobody said anything. The other thing is they were all such in shock, because other than the guys that were directly involved in screwing Bret, Shawn Michaels and Triple H, I guess, none of them were in on it. They were all as shocked and angry about it, because for them to break the script, not to follow the script, for them is dangerous, because, you can really get hurt in wrestling. And if you don't know what's coming, somehow somebody does a move and you're not expecting it, you can get damn well hurt. And they do get injured when mistakes are made. So the changing of the script was not just a sort of unprecedented thing from the point of view of any morality or respect and that kind of thing, but it goes to the core of their own safety, workplace safety, you can call it. So they were all kind of in shock. And because Bret said okay, they didn't want to say no to Bret. So we continued to shoot, and it never occurred to them, because the camera was on Bret, we were still recording everybody's audio. Like, I don't think Shawn Michaels, it just clicked for him that, hold on, we can hear him claiming he knew nothing and whatever. And then when Vince showed up, Bret said later he was sorry he had asked us to leave, but I'm sure Vince would have asked us to leave anyway. And so we left. And we hung out in the hallway outside. And, you know, for people that have seen the film, you can see. In fact, I heard later, you know, Vince claimed for a long time he never saw the film. He wouldn't watch it, and which is, I was sure was BS. But so I talked to somebody we knew who knew him and said, yeah, he watched it. And he thought it was a great film. And he really only hated one thing. And that's when he walks out after Bret punches him in the locker room. And he really punched him. Apparently, you know, Bret and others have said, you know, Vince went down like I don't know, like somebody had been shot. Anyway, when he gets out of and leaves the locker room, he's stumbling and dizzy. And Vince didn't like that because it made him look weak. And that's the only thing he apparently that he really didn't like in the film, which is kind of funny. Anyway, we stood out in the hallway and we got that, you know, incredible footage where Bret's wife denounces Triple H. Actually, now in recollection, Triple H maybe wasn't in the dressing room for some reason. He was outside waiting. And maybe because he was so in on it, which we all found out later, because later he admitted it and so did Shawn Michaels admit it.
Yeah.
Maybe he was afraid of what might happen to him in the dressing room. So he stayed in the hallway. Because, you know, in normal circumstances, I think he would have been in the dressing room.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. So we got kind of, again, ridiculously good access. So.
There have been so many rumors as to why Vince McMahon was even approaching the dressing room. Some said that Mark Calloway, The Undertaker, was so furious that he walked up to Vince McMahon and said, "You better get over there right away and apologize to Bret." And based on that, Vince McMahon actually went to the dressing room. I don't know if that's entirely true, but that's what I heard.
I think that is true, but I think that was part of a consideration that he would lose all credibility, prestige, authority if he didn't man up and quote unquote and take his medicine. You know, his argument was doing this was the best thing for the business. And Bret should have gone along with the best thing for the business. And this is where it got, you know, like Vince's argument was, listen, you know, he never said this outright publicly, but this is the argument. You know, winning the championship doesn't mean anything. You know what? It's all scripted. So, you know, whether you're the title holder and you lose it in Montreal, or you're the title holder and you lose it in New York next week, which is what Bret wanted. Why does any of that matter? You know, if it's just theater. So for the point of view of the business, where so much of the audience does take all this seriously, to have what Vince thought might happen, although Bret told him he wouldn't, Vince claims he thought that Bret would take the title and go directly to the WCW as the title holder. And that would somehow undermine the value, which is this theatrical, fictional value of the WWF title. And so that's why it mattered so much to Vince. But there's a problem with the argument, do what's good for the business, because it's just the business. Bret had negotiated as part of his agreement to leave the WWF, not to force Vince to honor up the contract. In other words, to let Vince out of this contract, Bret had negotiated, I think it was 90 days of creative control. Vince could not develop a storyline that Bret objected to. That was a contractual arrangement, a business arrangement. And not enough is made of that, because lots of other people have chimed in over the years. Bret was wrong because it is just a business and he shouldn't have taken it all so seriously. Well, if what happened to the character mattered so much to Vince, why shouldn't what happened to the character matter to Bret? For straight business reasons, never mind, what the Hitman stood for and all the rest. And contractually, it was Bret's choice whether he had to give up the title then or some other time. I mean, based on the creative control contract, he actually never had to give up the contract. He could have taken it with him. But he told Vince, he agreed with Vince, he would give it up, but just not in Canada. Partly because the value of the character in Canada, from a business point of view and emotionally, in terms of his connection with the fans. And Bret took his fans and what they thought of him quite seriously. It mattered to him. So from a business point of view, Bret had every right to say no. And not enough is made about that when people talk about this story.
I think Bret, by this time, had already fulfilled his contract, also in terms of dates. A major concern reportedly was that Bret was going to show up on WCW television wearing his belt, because a few years prior to the Screwjob, Alundra Blaze had shown up on Nitro with the women's title, and she dropped it in a trash can. Personally, I don't think Bret ever would have shown up on WCW television with the belt.
Quite the contrary.
Yeah.
If Vince had asked him to sign an agreement that he would give it up, they had another match planned, I think in New York or somewhere like that, in the US anyway, the next week. If Vince had asked Bret to sign an agreement that he'll give up the belt, then Bret would have signed it. It just meant more to Vince that it happened at that big pay-per-view. It was a much bigger match. The next match was just a normal TV gig. And he wanted it done with that big audience.
The whole scenario was so unfortunate for Bret, both personally and also professionally. But for WWE, it really opened new doors, because it really allowed Vince McMahon to create the Mr. McMahon character. And the incident ushered in the Attitude Era and his feud with Stone Cold Steve Austin. So from a business point of view, McMahon and the company did very well.
Oh, I think they were brilliant how they made use of it. And to a large extent, it was because of the film. The film was a massive hit and was seen by millions and millions of people. And I would guess hardly a wrestling fan didn't see the film at that time. And A&E kept playing it over and over again. People were joking it was the Wrestling with Shadows channel or the Hitman channel. They played it so many times. Every time they played it, it got these crazy high ratings. Yeah, I think McMahon and his writers were brilliant. Two things. One, they realized that even though the theater of it all was now fully exposed by the film, it kind of didn't matter. They said to themselves, well, it doesn't change how people don't stop going to movies because they realize, Arnold Schwarzenegger isn't really the Terminator. Because of suspended disbelief, it kind of doesn't matter. And so they almost went with it. They started almost mixing up things that were kind of shoot and behind the scenes stuff, and didn't care much anymore. And then, of course, as you say, McMahon was such a bad guy because of the storyline that came out of the film, which in fact he was kind of a bad guy. He went with it and became the corporate bad guy, Mr. McMahon, and that became his character, Mr. Corporate Bad Guy. And they were brilliant the way they used it. And honestly, I think it would have made absolutely no difference where the damn belt was dropped. But at the time, they thought it mattered.
Paul, thank you very much for taking so much time out of your schedule. I really appreciate that. Stay safe and let's talk soon.
Okay, bye-bye.